They called it the Iron Promise. A gift, they said, a safeguard of honor, purity, virtue. But beneath its cold gleam and ornate craftsmanship, a nobleman named Friedrich von Altenburg returned from the Crusades with a broken arm and a shattered faith. Had seen Jerusalem, yes, but not the holy city sung in psalms. Instead, he had walked streets slick with blood, had prayed beside men screaming in agony, had stared too long at crosses not made of gold, but of rotting flesh. When he came back to his manor, the world he left behind no longer fit the world he had become. There was pain, there was silence, there was blood. Meat and wine flowed like a river, and the nobles of Swabia laughed beneath the torchlight. Friedrich stood tall, his injured arm wrapped in black velvet, his other hand clutching a goblet. Not even when the maid, her only confidant, turned away in shame, she simply lay still, staring at the canopy above, tracing the swirling vines stitched into its velvet. 1,000 vines. 1,000 iron vines, wrapping, twisting, smothering. No more doubts, he roared. No more gossip. My honor shall be worn as iron. Soon her skin festered where the metal pressed too tightly. She began to walk with small, deliberate steps. The servants whispered that she had been cursed. But worse than the whispers were the prayers. In those dreams, the iron melted dripping down her legs like wax, and though she always awoke in terror for one brief moment, she felt ... warm. A charter of chastity, sealed with wax and witnessed by 4 men of noble blood. In it, Isolda's virtue was not only sworn but ensured. If ever she were found defiled, her dowry would return to Friedrich, her titles would be stripped, and her soul would be considered void in the eyes of the Lord. Because they weren't for her, they were for Friedrich. Whispers in the castle had turned her womb into a vessel of suspicion. Below the girdle was its binding. It looked like a belt gilded, adorned with floral engravings and Latin inscriptions, but it was made of iron, and at its center, a lock, small, intricate, almost delicate, as if forged by a jeweler rather than a blacksmith. He said it was a girdle of fidelity used by Eastern nobles to preserve the honor of their wives while at war. Isolda's lips quivered when she saw it, and her hand moved instinctively to her waist. If it already knew where the cold metal would bite because Friedrich was not alone, other lords saw the belt. Their men asked questions. For in Friedrich's 6-year absence there were no children, not even a whisper of pregnancy. The longer the belt stayed locked, the more distant he became. For he did not trust Isolda, but neither did he trust the belt. Night after night, he would pace outside her chamber, listening for what he did not know. A whisper, a sigh, a betrayal. And though she swore her chastity before the priest himself seemed to avert his gaze. In the winter of 1273, in the Duchy of Swabia, his wife Isolda greeted him with trembling arms. Her face had aged without time, cracked by loneliness, eroded by rumors, but Friedrich ... Friedrich brought with him a gift, a peculiar thing he claimed to have discovered in the camp of a Saracen lord. He called it protection, she called it punishment. But neither of them dared call it what it truly was, a prison. On the night it was locked upon her, a feast was held. Isolda sat silent. That night she did not cry, not when the key was turned, not when the iron bit into her hips, but the belt. The belt was more than a symbol. It was a transformation, a crucible of flesh. He believed he had done a holy thing. And in the chapel beneath the manor, where candlelight barely kissed the cold stone, a document was hidden. It was not a document, it was a curse. And the girdle ... Yet even in her silence, Isolda began to dream. Of fire, of rust, of keys lost to time. Friedrich grew restless. And so the belt, which was meant to give him peace, became his torment. And this was only the beginning. The iron promise, once whispered in courtly songs as a symbol of devotion, would soon take root in the darkest hearts of Europe. And behind each question was a door, and behind each door, another tragedy waiting to be unlocked. Winter passed, but the frost did not. It lingered in the halls of Altenburg, like a curse spoken too softly to be undone. And in the quiet, Isolda began to vanish, not in body, but in presence. She moved like mist, spoke like shadow, Her voice hollow and her laughter once soft and lilting was never heard again. What little color remained in her face drained as the months crept by. Beneath her gown, the iron bloomed sores. The hinges, rusting from sweat and tears, began to grind when she moved. Her hands were clasped in prayer, her lips chapped and blue. Blood had pooled beneath her, dark and silent. But when the girl rushed to her side, Isolde turned and smiled. No blacksmith was allowed near it. No physician dared to examine it. And Friedrich, he looked away. But here lies the cruelest irony of all. He still loved her. Silence, in his own twisted way. Friedrich believed he was saving her from sin, from the temptations of idle women. From the scandalous songs that echoed through the countryside, others had clasps that could only be opened with fire-heated keys. He sent them across Europe. 2 barons, 2 dukes, 2 kings. The iron had grown tired. Only the belt still locked lay resting atop her bed, polished clean, the key nestled beside it. To him the belt was not a weapon, it was an act of devotion. And like all devotions twisted too tightly, it began to suffocate. A note. One morning, the maid Anka girl, no older than 16, found Isolde kneeling in the snow-dusted chapel, unmoving. In Paris, a bishop condemned the practice, calling it a blasphemy of the womb. Yet in Florence, jewelers began crafting them in secret, fashioning locks with Latin etchings and roses made of bronze. They called them cintura di. Friedrich wept, yes, wept like a child broken. Not from grief, but confusion. For he could not understand how she had escaped. The lock was unbroken, the windows sealed, the doors watched. Monks visited him with scrolls, some praising his actions as righteous, others warning that the devil hides best in purity's disguise. But he listened only to those who agreed. But in the years that followed, sightings began to surface. When they finally broke down the door, they found him kneeling before the altar. The original girdle clasped around his own waist, sealed, welded shut, and seared into his flesh. "I dreamt of warmth," she whispered. Word of the girdle began to travel. In Innsbruck, a merchant's wife was found hanged from the rafters. A crude copy of Friedrich's belt clamped around her waist. In a veiled woman tending to plague victims, her hands scarred with iron burns. In a convent near Rome, a nun who never spoke, but painted only fire, and behind each one, a woman. And behind each woman. Friedrich, meanwhile, became obsessed. He commissioned books on anatomy, on sin, on the virtues of bodily restraint. He began to sketch new designs, more ornate, more secure. Some had teeth, and with each belt scent, his name grew. Friedrich the Chaste. Friedrich the Iron. But Isolde was still locked. One night, as the manor lay buried in snow, Isolde vanished. Her chamber was untouched, the window shut. No signs of struggle, no blood, no prints, no trail, and beside the belt, it read, "He who binds the body never captures the soul." The castle erupted. Every guard was questioned. The maid Ank was flogged, then thrown into the well. But Isolde was gone. Some claimed she was taken by spirits. Others whispered that she had made a pact with something older than the church. In the lowlands of Burgundy, a healer with gray eyes and a limp one image returned again and again. A woman without chains, with sorrow in her step and freedom in her gaze. But for Friedrich, she had become a ghost. He locked himself in the chapel. Days passed without food. He spoke to no one. He had finally placed upon himself what he had given to her. His last words, carved crudely into the stone wall beside him, read, "What is love? If not a cage we build for the ones we fear to lose." But the story did not end in Altenburg, because Friedrich's belts did not die with him. They had already spread like plague, like prophecy. And what came next would be darker still. In the year of 1321, almost 5 decades after Isolde vanished from the cold stones of Altenburg, a different kind of silence crept across the continent, not born of fear, but of fascination. For the girdles had evolved. It's no longer clumsy cages of iron and leather. They had become refined, quiet, almost beautiful. In Nuremberg, a city famed for its craftsmen, a man named Matthias Grunfeld was rising in fame. Clockmaker by trade, he had hands that could summon time itself. Raised in a house of ticking hearts and humming wheels, She grew not with dolls or music, but with brass and oil. Her mind was sharp, her hands precise, and when she turned 17, she unveiled her first invention. A chastity belt so intricate, so cleverly engineered, that it could only be unlocked through a sequence known to none but the maker. His gears were like lace, his automata whispered secrets in copper tongues. But what earned him the favor of dukes and lords was not time. It was control. Matthews had a daughter Lena born of a woman who died in childbirth, or so the servants claimed. It was a marvel, a mechanism of devotion, she called it, ornate, silent, and deceptively gentle. The lining was velvet. The gears responded only to temperature and pressure. It was not credit, it was art. The bride, no older than 14, was gifted one of Elena's belts by her father, the Duke himself. It was described in court records as a garland of virtue wrought in silver with clasps that sang when locked. Elena's workshop grew to 20 men. Each swore secrecy. Each knew only a portion of each mechanism. And still, she remained untouched by scandal. The bishop, when blessing it, stammered. His hands trembled. The girl did not speak. And it sold. The great brass doors of her workshop were shuttered. Rumors spoke of madness, that she had been visited by a spirit, that a woman in red robes had come from the Alps, asking strange questions, offering no name, that Elena had burned the plans for her latest design before it could be finished, a mannequin. Each returned to their courts with a gift encased in velvet and lined with cruelty. Elena's fame eclipsed even her father's. They called her the Maiden of Obedience, though none dared speak such titles in her presence. For Elena Grunfeld was no trembling Isolde. The walls were covered in diagrams, loops of metal intertwined with veins, poetry etched in Latin and Greek, and drawings. So lifelike they bled from the parchment. Women, locked and weeping, keys sewn into skin, belts that whispered when worn. Lords came bearing gold. Emissaries from Venice, from Prague, from Lyon, a sculpture, a confession. Every gear turned in silence. Upon her chest, etched in a circle of gold. She knew what she built, and she knew why they wanted it. It was at a royal wedding in Wurzburg that her most infamous piece was unveiled. 1 month later, she died of infection. The physician was hanged. The belt was buried with her, still locked, but the backlash never came. The evolution of Friedrich's obsession, instead, orders increased, but legends persist. That she still ticks inside. That her eyes follow you if you speak her name. That sometimes at midnight the clocks in Nuremberg pause, just for a breath, or it does not exist. The belts became bridal gifts, tokens of dowry, proof of worth. They were not hidden anymore. They were paraded, blessed, kissed by kings. But something had begun to change in her. She stopped appearing in public. Letters went unanswered. Then silence. It was her apprentice Lucas who finally broke open the doors 6 months later. Inside, the clocks had all stopped. Hundreds of them, frozen at midnight. And in the center of the room, no, not a mannequin. Elena still, cold, clad in her own creation. It wasn't a belt. It was a cage. Suspended from the ceiling, lined with mirrors, it encased her entire body from throat to ankle. I forged the locks not for them, but for myself. I would never become what they made of me. She had sealed herself in. There was no door. To this day, no one knows how it was built. The workshop was dismantled. Her body entombed, cage and all, in a cathedral sealed by iron and prayer. But Elena Grunfeld was not the end. She was the echo of Isolde. And as the Renaissance dawned on, age of light, of thought, of rebirth, something darker moved beneath it. A whisper passed from castle to convent, from cloister to courtroom. A phrase repeated like a warning. Virtue must be visible. And with that whisper came the fire. By the mid-16th century, the Age of Enlightenment had begun to unfurl its golden banners. Painters drenched canvases in light. Scholars weighed reason over faith. But in the quiet halls behind noble doors, beneath silk gowns and lace veils, the iron still clung to flesh, lavishly adorned, inlaid with pearls and enamel. They were displayed in public as symbols of discipline and decorum. But these were not the raw iron prisons of Friedrich, nor the whispering gears of Elena. These belts were masked in elegance, hidden behind layers of courtly refinement. no longer tools of pain but of spectacle. And perhaps that was the point. In a world teetering between reason and fear, the idea of a locked woman, beautiful, noble, untouchable, was far more potent than the truth. In the court of Queen Margaretha of Bohemia, chastity belts had become a fashion of virtue. A widow of 23, with a mind too sharp for embroidery and a gaze that made men feel seen. She had once been fitted with a belt as a child, a gift from her father before her wedding to a man 3 decades her senior. When he died of a fever 2 years later, she wore it still. Not because she chose to, but because no one had the key. The queen herself wore one. Or so they said. She never confirmed it, never denied it. And yet, behind the tapestries of her palace, the truth festered. No investigation was held. The priests declared it suicide. The court held a moment of silence, because one among her ladies-in-waiting, Clara von Amsel, had begun to speak, softly at first, then louder. 2 nuns, 2 merchants, 2 midwives, 2 other women in court, each of whom had once felt the cold bite of metal and believed themselves alone. Of chambermaids bribed to clean the filth that no noble dared admit existed. And, worst of all, of a secret chamber beneath the queen's personal wing where belts no longer in use were kept, catalogued like jewels. Hundreds of them. She spoke of infection, of locked girls with broken minds, each with a name. In Florence, a convent burned its collection of chastity belts and cast the ashes into the Arno. In Ghent, a physician was arrested for designing belts for noble families. His journals revealed detailed studies of internal damage caused by prolonged wear. In Spain, instruments of penance. In the New World, whispers tell of their use by missionaries, though no records remain, and perhaps none should. In Vienna, a theater troupe performed a tragedy titled The Lady and Her Lock, in which the protagonist removes her belt and walks into the sea, each stained. When Clara's words reached the court, they did not inspire pity, they inspired fear, not of what she said, but that others might listen. Exhibits in museums mostly fake, reproductions made to scandalize or titillate, iron objects misattributed, no evidence of mass use, the scholars say. No proof of widespread belts before the 19th century, they insist. So the queen summoned her, in private. It is said the meeting lasted less than an hour. And Clara never left the palace again. Only scars. 3 days later, her body was found at the base of the cliffs below the royal gardens. Her spine twisted, her mouth stuffed with parchment, but they did not burn her letters in time. For Clara had written dozens, a spark, tiny but alive. What fire it would become. Within a decade, whispers turned to sermons. The crowd wept, but the belts did not vanish. They hid. They evolved again. In England, they became training devices for disobedient daughters. What survived into modernity were shadows. But they do not speak of Isolde. They do not speak of Alina. They do not speak of Clara. Because history, written by hands unfamiliar with pain, often forgets the stories that leave no bones. And yet, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The click of a long-lost key. The creak of metal against skin. The whispered question, spoken not with malice, but with terrible love. Do you still love me, even if I do not trust you? Because that, in the end, is what the girdle was. Not just iron, not just control, but the physical embodiment of a single fear draped in virtue, soaked in blood, locked with a kiss. And though the world is changed, though the belts are gone, the question remains. What is more terrifying? A woman without chains, or a man who dreams of placing them?